In this video, you're going to learn one of the most important ideas that will allow you to take control of your camera, to make you smarter than your camera. If manual mode feels like a complete mystery to you, by the end of this video, that should all become clear, and you'll know exactly how to control your camera and be able to take stunning photos. I'm going to unravel the mystery of the exposure triangle in simple, easy to follow steps. And I'm going to make a promise to you. If by the end of this video you still don't understand the exposure triangle, then I'm going to put a link in the description, send me a message, and we'll arrange a one-to-one coaching call, and I'll go through it with you at your speed and make it clear all the bits that are confusing you. So the exposure triangle is made up of three settings: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. So when we look at it here, on the left-hand side of shutter speed, we have slow shutter speeds, and on the right, we have high shutter speeds. And it's the same on the other two sides. So with apertures, we start at wide apertures at the top and very narrow apertures at the bottom. And with ISO, we start with low numbers at the bottom and high numbers at the top. Let me explain those three concepts. Let's start with shutter speed. Imagine your camera is like your eye. Every time you blink, you take a photograph. Let's take the first variable, and that is shutter speed. So imagine that's like blinking. If you have your eyes open for a long period of time between blinks, say 5 seconds, you're letting a lot of light into your eye, and that is like a slow shutter speed. If you blink very fast, you're only letting in a small amount of light, and that's like a fast shutter speed. So let's move on to aperture. So aperture is like the pupil in your eye. If your pupils are very dilated and very large, then you're letting in a lot of light. If your pupils are very narrow and small, then not so much light. It's the same concept. So very wide apertures, widely dilated pupils, are low f numbers like f2.8 for example, and very narrow apertures, when your pupils close right down, are like high f numbers like f22 for example. So the final one we need to look at is ISO. So ISO is about the sensitivity of your eye to light. If you imagine when you come out first looking at a dark scene, your eyes haven't adjusted to it. They're not very sensitive to the limited amount of light that's available. And that is just like a low ISO. However, after some time, they've adapted and they've got very used to the low light scene, and you can see much more clearly. And that's like having a high ISO because your eyes are much more sensitive to the light. So let's see it in action. I'm sat in my kitchen here today, so let's just try and take an indoor shot of the kitchen. Got my camera set up to shoot a little scene indoors, and I've just set it in its default things. I'm going to try and shoot this in manual. So what I've actually got set at the moment was an ISO of 100, and that's typically of what you would default to because that is where your camera performs the best. Also got an aperture of f4, which is the widest that this lens on the camera will go to, and the shutter speed is currently a fifth. Now, what you will see is a blinking +2, which means the shot is going to be overexposed by 2 stops. I'll just take that shot so you can see what happens. And you can see it's all overexposed. So now, thinking about our exposure triangle, what could we adjust? My camera's on a tripod just for ease of filming, but if I was going to handhold this, I might make the decision to change the shutter speed because I want that to be faster, because usually you need something like a 40th of a second, somewhere around there, to be able to hold your camera steady enough. So let's make that adjustment. Now we've got it to a 40th, and actually it's saying it's about perfectly exposed. So let's take that shot. And there we have a nicely exposed photograph. The highlights, which are the lights under my cabinets, are flashing on that scene because they're overexposed. So imagine I wanted to take a shot where they weren't overexposed. I've got a choice of 3 things I could do. I could adjust the shutter speed even more so it takes it faster, lets less light in. The other thing I could do is make my aperture smaller. So for the sake of this example, let's make the aperture smaller, and that looks a bit better. So I've increased the f number, which means made a smaller aperture, to f7.1. The other advantage of this is it will give me a better depth of field. So let's take that shot. You can see that's exposed now for the highlights, so there's nothing getting blown out there. Now, just as another example, let me go back to what my original f-stop was, which was f4. Imagine you wanted to capture some action, so you wanted a fast shutter speed. So I've set my shutter speed now to a 2/50th. I'm hoping maybe I can catch that light blinking. I'm leaving my aperture at the widest it can go because I want to have as much light getting in as possible, but still my photograph is underexposed. So what can I do now? Well, I can adjust the third thing. I can adjust my ISO. So if I go across here, now adjust my ISO and increase that. Let's take that up to 400. And now the scene looks about right. So let me take that shot, and that seems pretty good. So that's how you adjust each of the three parameters. Let me just point out a few common pitfalls. High ISO adds a lot of grain and makes your picture look very noisy. That particularly shows up if you do any editing to your photos and try and bring up detail that might have been lost in the shadows. A slow shutter speed might cause motion blur if you're not using a tripod, because you can't hold your camera steady enough to prevent any little shake showing up in the photo. And then the final one is, if you're using apertures that are very wide, if you have a lens that can go to something like f1.4, for example, that will give you a very shallow depth of field, which means if you've got subjects that span right across your frame, or there is a lot of depth in your image, then only the things that you focus on will be in focus. Things in the foreground and the background may well be out of focus. Now, you should have a good idea of how the exposure triangle works and how that affects your camera and how you can take charge and become smarter than your camera and take some stunning photos. If you haven't, don't forget my promise. Sign up for a coaching call. I'll leave a link in the description below, and I'll talk you through it at your speed, and we can explain any points that are confusing you.